Welcome everyone. I'm Jacqueline Balderrama. I'm the project manager for 1,000 Languages, and we're thrilled to welcome our panelists for the literary translation panel, Rachel Galvin, Daniel Borzutzky, and Sarah Viren. 1,000 Languages is an ever-developing database of work previously published in Hayden's Ferry Review, translated into manifold world languages. We're a Virginia G. Piper Center initiative and offer fellowships and offer internships to students and community engagement. And we're really thrilled to have these panelists here with us today. Many thanks to Justin Petropoulos and Piper team members, Christy Mills, Sheila Black, and Ileana Garcia for organizing today's event. And a special thanks to Laurel Street, who is recording for today. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to invite the director of the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing, Alberto Ríos, to share a few words.
Welcome everybody, bienvenidos todos. I just want to say a few brief words. Translation, when it was first used as a word, was in the early 1300s, and the word was very simple. It meant transfer. Somebody's at the door.
To the translation panel.
Wrong call.
Sorry. Yes.
In the 1300s, it was a simple word, and it meant the word was essentially transferring. It was a word of work, of purpose, of intent. Even there, it was almost a verb, even when it was a noun. It was at work, and its work was hope, betterment, clarity, sharing of knowledge. It meant something. It meant to give as a gift something to someone else that they did not have. In this case, it was an intellectual gift. I am happy to be part of that endeavor for the greater good. So as the arts create a better world, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to our panel today.
So I'll briefly introduce each of the panelists, after which they will present or share a little bit about how they came to translation. You're welcome to come to the podium or stay where you're at. And then we'll enter into a further discussion on craft and process of translation. Rachel Galvin's most recent poetry collection is Utopia, published by Persea Books. She is also the author of Elevated Threat Level, a finalist for the National Poetry Series, and Pulleys and Locomotion. Her translations include Raymond Queneau's Hitting the Streets, winner of the 2014 Scott Minecraft Prize, and Oliverio Gerondo's Decals, complete early poetry, with Harris Feinsod, a finalist for the 2018 National Translation Award. Her current project, translating the poetry of Alejandro Abaran Polanco, is supported by a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. Galvin is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Chicago, where she teaches in the Creative Writing Program and is the faculty lead for the Translation Studies.
Hi everyone, Jackie, thank you so much, and Sarah, it's wonderful to meet you finally, and Alberto, thank you for the warm welcome. We're delighted to be here. Thank you for all of you. I can't believe how many people came out to talk about translation. This is great. This is wonderful. This is Felix. He may decide to pipe up and give his opinions about things. He's 14 months old, but hopefully he'll be cool. So how I came to start to translate. In the late 90s, I was doing a creative writing degree at the Michener Center at UT Austin, and for my thesis, my a professor I was working with, August Kleinzahler, said, oh, you speak French, you should translate some French poems. And he gave me the Random House, the 20th Century French Poetry Anthology. And I picked out 3 poets whom I had read as an undergraduate and liked very much: Boris Vian, Jacques Prévert, and Raymond Queneau. And I translated all 3 of them as part of my thesis, and kind of thought that was it. And then a few years later, I was working at the National Endowment for the Humanities, actually, and discovered that they had internal fellowships, which is nice. So if you're thinking about jobs in the humanities, where you could actually apply for paid time off your job to do a creative or intellectual project. So I did that and got time to work on a translation of Raymond Queneau's book, Courir les Rues, which I published in 2013, 10 years ago. at that point, you know, I had grown up speaking Spanish, and I thought, oh, I should start translating some poetry from Spanish as well. And did some poems here and there. Cesar Vallejo, who's one of my great favorites, the Peruvian poet of the 20th century. We just had the centenary of his book Trilce, which came out in 1922, and ended up doing Oliverio Girondo's early work with a friend of mine, Harris Feinsod, who, you know, that was the first time I had collaborated on a translation. I highly recommend it too. If you find somebody who you're simpatico with, it is a very productive. Do you want to come be part of the conversation? Yeah. So that's how I got started translating. I've done other kinds of collaborations, sometimes with people who speak languages that I don't, collaborating together, which is an interesting experience, very different from translating from a language that you know intimately. And I think I'm going to stop there. That's how I got started. I'll just say, right now, the project I'm doing, I did a chapbook with Ugly Duckling Press a couple of years ago on Alejandro Barran Polanco, who's a contemporary Mexican poet who lives in Jalapa, who's absolutely genius, and also a conceptual artist and a musician, and I'm now doing a full-length book, which is what that fellowship is supporting, of his work. So that was a little bit scattered because I'm a little distracted, but I think we hit the major points, and thank you very much. Okay.
Daniel Borzutzky is a poet and translator in Chicago.
Yeah.
His most recent work is Written After a Massacre in the year 2018. His 2016 collection, The Performance of Being Human, received the National Book Award. Lake Michigan 2018 was a finalist for the Griffin International Poetry Prize. His most recent translation is Paula Isabel Nunez's The Loose Pearl. His translation of Gallo Gigliotto's Valdivia received the 2017 National Translation Award. And he has also translated collections of Raúl Zurita's and Jaime Luis Wenun's. He teaches English and Latin American and Latino studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you, Alberto, for having us, and Justin putting this together, Sarah for conversing with us, and everybody for being. So, you know, I started translating kind of about the time I started writing seriously when I was, 23 or 24. My family is from Chile, and I grew up speaking Spanish, and I had a friend in Chicago who was a Chilean artist who gave me a copy of a book by the Chilean writer Juan Emar. And actually, there was a book by Juan Emar that was just published in English by Megan McDowell called 1 Year, I think. And Juan Emar was a fiction writer of the 30s. Juan Emar was a pen name. His real name was, which he took because it sounded like the French J'en ai marre, which means something like I'm fed up. And I had no idea what I was doing, and I had no idea what translation might lead to, but with the help of my friend, and I translated this very hard writer, and that started something that became a kind of lifelong practice. I mean, one of the interesting things about that project was I also quickly learned how hard it was to work with the estates of dead writers, because, you know, every sort of semi-obscure dead Latin American writer has a foundation which is like run by their nephew who's a lawyer, and to make it very hard to get rights. And that was a really interesting and quick introduction to also like the business of translation. But as I started to translate more, the first book I published of the first book of poetry I published was by a Chilean Mapuche writer named Jaime Luis Wenun. And again, I mean, I like was in a bookstore in Chile, and I pulled his book off the shelf, and I liked it. and I very innocently turned up at the publisher's office, and they were very suspicious of me, as they had every right to be. But I started working on that book, and I think what I did not understand was that translation would be the ways in which translation would be transformative. I mean, and on one level, it was very transformative to my own writing, because I think as somebody who was kind of maybe more interested in Latin American writers than I was in writers from the US, it sort of gave me a whole range of influences that I think my contemporaries did not necessarily have, and a kind of different understanding of how poetry can be. But on a much different level, it has been the source of relationships that have been so incredible and meaningful. And so I published this book of Gallo Gigliotto, who's a contemporary Chilean poet and novelist. And then he translated a book of mine, and we have become very good friends, and we have collaborated on other things, and translation has sort of allowed for me to be invited to participate in literary communities in Cuba and Mexico, and do things that I wouldn't have imagined. So I think that that's one of the things I always tell people who are thinking about getting involved in translation, is that it's on the one hand a creative practice, but on the other hand it is a social practice as well, in the best possible way. So I have more to say, but I'll stop.
Sarah Viren is a contributing writer of the New York Times Magazine and author of the essay collection Mind, which was longlisted for the Penn Diamondstein Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay and finalist for the Lambda Literary Award. She translated the novella Cordova Skies by Federico Falco, along with a number of the Argentine author's short stories, and is currently co-editing an anthology of the essays in the Americas, The Great American Essay, which is forthcoming from Mad Creek Books. Viren's work has been supported by the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Kerouac House residency, and a Fulbright student grant to Columbia. She is an assistant professor in the creative writing program at Arizona State University.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Tita. Thank you, my students who are here, and everybody else is here. It's great. And thank you, Rachel, for being here and for bringing your son. I was just thinking we're going to read Edith Grossman's Why Translation Matters. And I was reading it the other night, and there's a quote from Octavio Paz in there where he says that really the worst form of translation is when we learn to talk. So I was thinking about that as I was watching Felix. Trying to. Also, my brother was just here visiting, who has a son about that age. And he started to use the word spider for everything. And so his parents were saying, oh, I think you really like spiders. And my wife, who's a linguist, said, no, they don't realize that when kids are learning language, if they notice that an adult praises them for using a word, they continue to use it for everything. So he doesn't really like spiders probably, just spider is a convenient word. So my story of translation is a little, I think a lot of us, a lot of us have stumbled into translation. But what happened to me was that I was at University of Iowa doing my MFA in creative nonfiction, and when I finished, I got a English teaching Fulbright to Columbia, and I went there planning to live on the coast of Columbia. I just spend my time there working on another writing project, but I happened to be part of my departmental email chain, and I was still receiving emails from them. And one of the emails said that the International Writing Program at Iowa, which is this really great residency where they bring in international writers to Iowa City for the fall semester, and they give readings, they visit local schools, and they work on their own work. They were starting a translation workshop with those writers, and so they were asking writers in the Iowa City area to join that translation workshop. And they didn't have enough people. And I looked at the list of writers, and one of them happened to be a Colombian writer, Pilar Quintana, who was in Iowa City while I was in Columbia. And I said, well, if I can join by Skype, I'll try translation. And they said, sure. And so I joined every week by Skype. I met Pilar, I started reading her stories, I started translating her stories, and I just kind of fell in love with it. It was so much fun. And it was so much fun to be working with a writer collaboratively. I think before I went and got my MFA, I was a journalist, and I think it reminded me a little bit of like the newsroom. You've probably seen like the newsroom in movies, right? It's like, there's like lots of people talking, like, writing, you do your writing, but then it's collaborative. You send it off to your editor, the editor, changes your lead. Like, there's a lot of collaboration, and you kind of lose that when you become this like creative writer working alone at her desk. And so I really loved the way that worked. And when Pilar went back to Columbia the following semester, I was still there, so I went to visit her in her house, and I hung out, and we got to be friends. And so the following year, I went back to Iowa City, and I decided to enroll in they have an MFA in literary translation. And so I decided to do that, and I thought, well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to work with another writer via the International Writing Program. And Federico Falco, who's an Argentine writer who I already adored, was going to be one of those writers. And so I said, I want to work with him. And that year, what they did is they created this like speed dating thing, where basically like all the writers that all the translators that wanted to work with writers, they put us in a room, and then all the writers are in the room, and then they're like, okay, go, go talk to go find your mate. And so I was like, surely everybody's going to jump on Federico because he's an incredible writer. But I think people were nervous, and so I just beelined towards it, and I said, hey, can I be your translator? And I began, I started translating his stories that semester, and then I translated a novella, and we became good friends. It was really nice that we had like dinner together, and it was just a really sort of warm, collaborative relationship. So that was my start, and I'll just say that one other thing, I think a lot of people that I know come to translation through poetry, but as that semester, that year, I started studying translation theory, and what really attracted to me to that was that it was this whole body of writing that talked about ethics alongside aesthetics, and that was something that I'd really, really been wanting in the study of creative nonfiction and hadn't received. I hadn't figured out a way to talk with nuance and complication about all the ethical issues that are related to writing about the real world, translating that onto the page that we do in creative nonfiction. It tends to be treated very sort of black and white. And translation theory people have been thinking about this for centuries. It's like, how do we do this? What's the ethics of doing this? What are systems of power related to? Like all these sort of like really complicated but interesting ethical questions that you have to consider alongside the aesthetic questions. I just loved that about translation.
Thanks. Thinking about ethics and also your background as creative writers, how does your creative writing work inform your translation practice? And are you ever tempted to change things or bring more of yourself into the translation? How do you deal with that temptation?
Yeah, okay. So this I'm going to answer your question and also link back to something Daniel said about community and how translation has brought me into communities that I didn't know about and that have been really formative and important to my writing and thinking and life in general. So when I started translating Raymond Queneau, who is a French writer who in 1960 co-founded a group called Oulipo, which was, I'm seeing heads nod, of experimental writers and, experimental writers and mathematicians working together to come up with new forms for literature. So not just poets, but also fiction writers, nonfiction writers, and so forth. And so he's quite famous for having started this group that included Georges Perec, who wrote a novel that is missing the letter E in it, for example, which is the most common letter of the alphabet in both French and English. So that's really a feat. Which is a word he could not use in his novel. Because Queneau was the founder of Oulipo, I started meeting contemporary members. This is also France's longest running literary movement, which is shocking. Out of all of its centuries, it's been running nonstop since 1960. And if you go to Paris, they still have one evening a week at the National Library. You can go see these writers give each other challenges to write something for that particular day that they then have to perform. And so I met some of these contemporary writers to ask them for help with the translation I was doing. And then sort of became friends with them and started translating some of their contemporary work as well. And the end result of this is that, to get back to your question, with some friends of mine, we started talking about translating really constrained work. What do you do if you can't use the letter E, right? What do you do if you're translating something that's all anagrams? So it has to, you could have to mix up the order of the letters and come up with a different word or phrase, right? And the answer is that you need a lot of creative liberty, right? You need a lot of freedom to make something that works and that's funny or interesting or strange in the language you're translating into. And the result of these conversations was that about 10 years ago, we formed a creative translation group that's called Transpo, so we're riffing on the Ulipo. And we've been doing collaborative creative translation projects ever since then. So all kinds of things like a group homophonic translation. Anybody know what a homophonic translation is? Does this ring a bell? So that's where you translate the way that the words, oh, this is hard to explain, the way that the words sound into the target language, but not the meaning. So like, okay, the French word merci, thank you. You might translate it as mercy in English, right? Because that's what it sounds like, even though that's not the semantic content of the word. So we did a group, multilingual, we had like 12 languages involved, homophonic translation of a French poet's work. And then another creative translation project we did just a couple years ago, which was one of my favorite things that we've done together. There's, at the Sao Paulo Biennial, there was a group of artworks, video, dance, painting, all different media, and we translated those artworks into poems that were then put on the wall as wall texts next to the art. So they were very not informative. Like if you wanted to know who made the work and what it was doing, you wouldn't find out from our text. And these were then collected into a book and given out at the exhibit and things like that. So we've kind of taken that idea that it's impossible to create a faithful translation, right? That doing something that's an exact replica of the original is impossible, and then pushed it to this extreme of creating something else entirely. So it's a very kind of extreme example of that, but it's something that I've found to be really generative and exciting.
I'm happy to.
I can go, yeah,
Sure.
I don't want to follow the same
Wait,
order.
mix it up.
Vote and voting. So a couple things. One is, I think that translating, because I have almost entirely translated prose, but for writers who write much differently than me, because how are you going to find a writer that writes it the same way as you do? And I think that the ventriloquism, which I've seen somebody use that as sort of a metaphor, the loss of your own style, or like setting aside your own style, and helps you also be conscious of, it's helped me be conscious of what my style is, what my stylist's tics are, perhaps what my crutches are stylistically, because I'm kind of forced into another person's shoes, clothes, body, etc. And I really try to write as they would write in English. It makes me more conscious and aware of how I write, and that's been really helpful in pushing myself as a writer. And then the other thing I think is that just as an essayist, it's been really helpful to read more deeply and think more about the Latin American essay and what might be considered. I'm working on this anthology now with a colleague of Rachel's, which is about the essay in the Americas, and so we've been thinking about what would be considered an essay, particularly from Latin America, where ensayo, what's considered an ensayo is slightly different than often what's considered an essay in English. And so as an example, one thing we've been thinking about is testimonial, which is this, the most famous example is Alberto and this idea of, her telling her story and representing the story of others. And, when her, I don't know how long after her book was published, it's been criticized by some academics who say that, oh, certain things in there are not true because they didn't match up to whatever factual information this academic had dug up. But that is sort of pushing our definition of what is true onto a different form. And the idea, I'm really interested in the idea of testimonial not having the I represent the we, and so that we're really thinking what it means to write from an I or write from a, sort of a we perspective. And so I think reading and starting to translate ensayos, or what might be ensayos or essays from Latin America, has allowed me to rethink the way that sort of that genre has been defined through Europe, right? And like how I might potentially resist that in thinking about the way, not only my own writing is formed, but also the way that my writing fits into this sort of larger genre of essay writing, or the literary essay. And that's just been, in some ways it's freeing as a writer. I don't know if it particularly changes me stylistically, but it's really freeing to think about situating my writing in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many kind of different ways of thinking about the ways in which my own writing and translation are intertwined, but I think to the one question about like that Sarah was talking about sort of how your aesthetic is imposed or not imposed, I mean, I was thinking something very similar, that like there's no way to sort of not have a voice in an aesthetic as you are translating, but like the nice thing about translation is that like you can actually kind of escape your own voice and you don't have to be yourself for a while, or or at least you're like trying to not impose your own voice, right? Or and I think that is like Sarah was saying, teaches you a lot about your own writing by kind of immersing yourself into somebody else's kind of mind and voice in such a different way. So that's a sort of like linguistic level. On like a very different level, there's ways in which I think my writing and translation are very, very intertwined. In 2008 or so, I started working with the Chilean poet Raúl Zurita, who has simply like become a very important poet for me as a writer, right? And that wasn't like something I intended to do. I was kind of invited to translate some of his work, and as I immersed myself in his work, I'm a very different writer than him, but I think he allowed for me to see some very clear things about like the kind of writer I wanted to be and the kind of things that were possible in writing. So I think in some sense, like the like impulse is to sort of deny that you're like influenced by the work you're translating, but I would say something very different, and that work has just been really exciting to be involved with. But there's other ways where like my kind of experience as somebody trying to understand what it meant to be a Chilean living in Chicago was very much a part of my writing, and my translating was sort of trying to understand what being a Chilean that was sort of like ruined by Chicago and the University of Chicago economists through the work of the Pinochet dictatorship and the economic program that was instilled there was coming clear in my translation. And so like those two things very much intersected and allowed me to kind of see the ways in which Chicago and Chile were very interrelated places, and that a lot of the practices that Chicago imported to Chile in the 70s were being sort of re-imported into Chicago in the 2000s, such as the closing of public schools and the privatization of public education and the militarization of the police force, the use of torture, the destruction of social services and medical services and of labor unions, right? And those were all of these kind of like interrelated connections that translation allowed me to see. I think the last thing I would say is like, I also think about like translation as like a like I think about things like what does it mean to try to translate a breath, right? What does it mean to try to like translate a scream? What does it mean to kind of try to translate somebody else's silence or like your own silence, right? And so in some ways, like translation sort of like allows me all these, and those are like questions I ask about my own writing, and translation allows me to think about, to kind of enter my own work through this very different starting place.
We have a lot of student translators in the room too. I guess I'm thinking, like, what about compromises in translation that you faced with regards to translating meaning, sound, form, or more? And how do you weigh those decisions? How do you balance or decide like which to prioritize?
You know, again, I think I'm going to answer that and link to something
That
else
sounds great.
that's been discussed
Yes,
as well.
please do.
So when I was translating Alejandro Barran's work, one of the benefits of working with a living author is I can ask him questions about what he meant, which is amazing. It really takes some guesswork out. And there's, contemporary Mexican slang that I might not know, and he helps explain to me, and it's often something entirely different from what I thought it might be. So I learn a lot through that process. And it also gives me more latitude because he can say, okay, do something creative with this, or I say, how is this versus that, and he can weigh in on it. But occasionally with his poetry, as I said, Alejandro is a musician, and there's a real strong focus on rhythm and music in his work. And so he'll tell me sometimes, there's this string of wordplay, and the rhyme is really important to me. It's kind of hidden, it's not at the end of the lines, but the rhyme is still really important. And so I'll try to translate to preserve that, even if the words are slightly different, right? I might have 4 options to choose among the translation of one word, and I'll go with one that's a little bit further afield because it rhymes. But I have his permission to do that, right? So that is a different kind of situation than when you're translating somebody you can't speak with. And maybe you had a similar experience with Paula when you were translating this book in terms of being able to consult with her. And I'll say, just to tie back to how the translation has affected my work as well. So I started translating Alejandro. I didn't know him at all, but I got paired with him through something that's called Lit and Loose Festival that takes place in Chicago every year. And it's been over 10 years now, is that right? Yeah. So each year there's a creative exchange where writers, dancers, musicians, all kinds of creative people from Mexico and Chicago get together, first in Chicago and then in Mexico City, to collaborate. So you're paired with somebody you don't know to make something new. And then there's a big performance and a series of smaller performances. And it's really fun. And in some ways there's a kind of time constraint to that because you have a week to make something new and then show it to hundreds of people. So I was paired with Alejandro and a musician in Chicago. And what we ended up doing was taking some of his poems and some of my poems that responded to news, especially news of violence of various kinds, and weaving lines together to create this new text, which we then performed with musical accompaniment. And that was before my previous book had come out, and it really changed the poems that I had brought to that project through working with him and having conversations about some of these things we're talking about around ethics of representation and witnessing and things like that. He was thinking about very similar questions in the Mexican context that I was thinking about in the US context. So that's the way that the translation project kind of grew tentacles and changed some of my own poems through the process as well.
So one thing I'd say is that translation is often talked about through like metaphors of loss, right?
Or violence.
Or violence, but like I'm thinking like Robert Frost's poetry is that which is lost in translation, which has done like more damage to translation. Maybe it's done damage to poetry, but it has like instilled this idea that translation is impossible. And so while it is certainly true that like when you're translating, like if there is a kind of rhythm or a rhyme scheme or something like that, it is often hard to replicate. It is often hard to recreate that in a different language, right? But like to try to, I try to not think about it as like a loss, right? But to think like, okay, so like I might not be able to do this thing, and I might not be able to like get that same kind of, I don't know, syllable count or rhythm, but like what can I do?
Yep.
Right? Like what does English make possible that that the original text that is kind of contained in the original text, which and that allows for a kind of like creativity and experiment that when you're working with the writer is also really helpful, because the writer can sort of like lead you to things or give you certain kinds of permission that can be really freeing. So like Rachel was saying, like when I'm translating somebody, I just published this book by the Chilean writer Paula Ilavaca Nunez, and I worked on this book for like 5 years and probably sent her like 5,000 questions from the like mundane, like what does this word mean, to like I don't know, like to the like what were you thinking about when you did that, like to try to understand something about the kind of like psychological process that went into the writing of the text. And in some ways, like if the writer's not willing to answer those questions, I don't actually really want to work with them, because like you can feel like you're a nuisance if you're a translator and you're like asking questions, and if the person doesn't respond graciously, it's sort of not worth it to me to invest that kind of time. So yeah, that is a way that I would think about it, is to like think about, yes, there is like things that you can't do, but like what is possible? What can you try to kind of find in the text and find language for in a new context?
Well, and that Robert Frost poetry is what's lost in translation. I think Octavio Paz had a rebuttal to that. He said poetry is what's found in translation, which I love, because that's sort of what we're talking about, right? Like that the creativity happens, something new is made, like this work continues on in a new way. So maybe poetry is what's found in translation.
Yeah, so we're, for the class, when the folks are here from the class, we're reading Daniel Kahn's Catching Fire. And what I really like about that, which I feel like is not present enough when we talk about translation, is process, like translation as a process. We tend to think of the finished product and whether or not it's faithful or not to the original, and then we have these two, but really if we think about what translation is, it is process. I mean, that's that thing we can't describe, that we try to have all these metaphors to like describe what it is. It's not just walking over a bridge, it's something else. And so I think, and in that book he says, and I feel this way, that, if I translated this a month later, I could have translated it differently, right? That it, and sort of accepting, I think that, as artists and writers, sometimes we're all leaning towards, hoping for the perfect, the ideal, the utopian, right? The idea of sort of this utopian dream of what could be the ideal translation. But what's actually pretty freeing about translation is that you'll never get that, and as creative writers, we'll never get that. We're never able to replicate this ideal that we have in our head of what we want to write. You have some sort of version of that, right? And I think that's actually that's beautiful, and I really love, sort of giving into the failure of it, the inherent failure of it, which doesn't mean loss necessarily. I think it's really creative. But in that book, Daniel Kahn talks about we're not just recoding, but we're encoding again. Like it's not, we're creating along with, rather than just sort of copying. I was thinking about what was difficult for me, especially in the novella by Ferry that I translated, and I think that what was most difficult for me was that it was about two young boys who were like exploring their sexuality, and so there was a lot, you talk about slang, there was a lot of slang related to jacking off and like, and so I just had to, like, I polled all my male friends and asked, like, what kind of language did you use to talk, for like talking about your penis and jacking off, and like, because I was just like,
like.
Which English is really limited.
It is. Because also things always felt much more adult. These are young
Yeah.
boys.
No, I had long conversations with Rachel about like how to translate a woman masturbating into into a kind of slang in English, right? And like I don't remember if I used jacking off, but like we had this long conversation. Can a woman jack off? Is that like the word, right? And like it, you know. And Spanish has a lot more words.
Yep.
From what I hear, Portuguese has tons of words.
That's a language in training. Yeah, no, and it like, and things, and it's like that level, it's tone, right? Like things can become much
Exactly.
more vulgar than they're intended to be,
Right.
and so, yeah, I mean, I think, but that's actually kind of fun, right? It's fun to write to your friends and ask them. When they were younger, right?
That's definitely a complexity of translation, right? Is the question of register,
Mhm.
of tone. Because you don't want to make it too formal or too informal, unless you're trying to do something else with the piece, and that can be really complex. Yeah. Especially in the realm of sexual vocabulary.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But I think even, well, from Spanish or French, that if we're looking at the Latin word, we can,
Right.
if you're not paying attention, it can sound, the register can be higher than you intend, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Kind of in the vein of thinking about the limitations or moving right between languages, with the languages you're working in, Spanish and French, what's like one large-scale difference you routinely encounter with translation and your method of addressing it? And conversely, or if you want to answer this instead, is there something small that seems to crop up every time?
Between languages? I mean, gender is always an issue. Between, that's really complicated because French and Spanish are so heavily gendered, and that's tricky. Also, in English, we don't use the impersonal. We don't say one wishes to eat lunch now, right? Like, I mean, it's like, who are you? And that's complicated because in both French and Spanish, there are ways to be more impersonal about it. And to use the passive voice in a way that doesn't feel stilted also. So that's something, I mean, they're both Romance languages with heavily Latinate roots, and so that, those are two things that come up all the time. And also because sometimes if an author has something that's ambiguous, so you don't know the gender, you don't want to gender somebody in English when this is purposefully being avoided, for example. And that ambiguity is intentional, and so trying to come up with a workaround is always complicated.
Yeah, and I find too, just syntactically, the way that sentences are structured, I'm always interested in like, can I end on the same like fundament as that's in the original, especially if it feels important, and it's hard. It's often hard just because of where we put the adjectives in English versus where they would be in Spanish. But I feel like if you're thinking of, to me in prose, what feels most important is, besides meaning, is the rhythm of the sentence, is like being able to, and so a big part of the rhythm is like, how do you land? How does the sentence land? And I think that's something I struggle with a lot, is like, is there a way to land with the same sort of idea or object or whatever it is, and still have the sentence sound good, meaningful.
I like this question.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a few things. I mean, one, pronouns, which in the Spanish are not always totally clear, tend to be hard sometimes in English. And then these questions of register, like, and the formality of Spanish, like, el libro de Daniel, like the book, how many ofs am I going to use? Do I make it sound too informal if I, say Daniel's book instead, right? Like those questions crop up a lot, and then there's like, I think, in all translations, these sort of questions of like what a reader in, let's say, Chile knows that somebody in the United States picking up this book might not know, and what to do with that information. And those questions, like, I think, come up a lot, right? Like, Do you explain it? Do you like keep it? Do you write like a introductory essay? Do you put a footnote? Right? Like, and my tendency is to sort of want to not do anything and to like present it as much as it's being presented in the original. But there are times I think where that like gap is too big, and you have to do, and if you feel like you have to do something.
And that question is one that I feel like has been really helpful in me thinking about my work as a creative writer as well, because I think the thing that's nice, that I love about translation is that it forces us to consider so many ethical issues that you don't necessarily have to consider. Like when you're writing your poetry, you don't have to think about readers, but you should. You should think about like who your readers are, or who you're imagining that you're writing to. But in translation, you really are forced, not throughout the entire project, but there will be moments in which you have to think like, do I need to explain that like airing out the house is like sort of normal practice, whereas in the United States, the idea of airing out your house, like not everybody would understand why one would do that. And so I think that, again, it's that idea that translation forces you to consider all these questions, even if you don't have answers to them. I like that about it.
And you're airing out your house in South America and there's no central heat.
Right.
Cold.
His book, Exercises in Style, goes beyond us talking about just simply the language of a scene and instead takes us to the scene, which I think is such an active translation that whole book is such a lesson to us. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel like that is an excellent book to use to teach translation or writing. Because, so to give a quick recap, so this is a book that came out in 1943, and he wrote it under the occupation in France. And it takes this really boring, banal episode. It's like a stupid anecdote that you would tell somebody, like your roommate, and say, I was on the bus this morning and I saw a guy and the buttons were hanging off his coat. This evening, I went to the subway station, I saw the same guy with the buttons hanging off his coat. It's like, who cares, right? But he takes that and he tells it 99 different ways. So he uses slang, he uses Britishisms, he writes it in limericks, he uses 99 different forms to tell the same story. So they're all utterly different. And like the thing that I just told you is like, version 5,000 or whatever, because there's no way to know what the like actual core episode was. So I think it's a great way to think about some of the things that we've been talking about here, like the difference in register, difference in realms of vocabulary, the way that rhythm and rhyme change language, to see how if you take the same story and you write it different ways, it comes out with a different meaning. Yeah, I'm excited that you love that book.
Oh, what I love about it too is if we talk only about translation, we're so tightly wound. But that has humor, that has
So funny.
patience,
Yes, yeah.
that has a whole other way to approach something very, very important. And
Yeah.
it was a big breakthrough book for me. I love that book. I didn't read it in French, but.
But it's really well translated by Brian.
I have to say, translating
Really good.
that book that translates scenes
It's
must have
such
been
a challenge.
something.
Yeah, all hats off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just one thing about humor, that's what I like about the Daniel Kahn book, is that it's funny. And I do think with translation we can be a little too serious at times. There's a lot of humor within the practice, so.
Totally.
But, yeah.
Totally.
There's lots of important ethical questions, but yeah.
Yes, there's always yeah. And translating humor is really hard. It's
Yeah,
really
oh my
hard
gosh.
to translate a joke. It's super difficult. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I could keep talking about Camille, but I'm
Oh,
gonna.
and I would like you to.
Yeah, don't be shy. I know some of my interns have questions and.
Are some of you translators here? Are people translating things right now? Or have translated or wish to translate?
Can I just mention a very quick anecdote about Octavio Paz? I was with a group of poets, Mexican and American, and we were to visit Octavio Paz. This was right before he died. So we went to visit, but we got a message saying, don't come, he won't be able to see you. He was already close to death. But he sent us a message, and I've just never forgotten it. He said, ya no estoy en la tierra, estoy en las nubes, pero en las nubes hay cosas bonitas. I'm not on earth anymore, I'm in the clouds. But in the clouds there are beautiful things. He had that white blindness, that Borges had. He must have practiced that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's, yeah.
Oh, we had a hand?
Yeah, at what point when you're translating a story, let's say, that requires you to digress, become more and more unfaithful to get the essence, at what point do you avoid the temptation to just write your own story? It becomes your story instead of the writer's story.
You do more stories.
Well, no, I don't think I've ever, there have been, you know, with sentence structure, I think there's times when you can almost feel yourself being like, oh, I wanna change that sentence, and that's again like your own style, and so I think I've had that urge, but I haven't. But we are, one book we're gonna read for class is Jack Spicer's on Lorca, which is like a really interesting collection in which it's like comprised of his letters to Garcia Lorca and his translations of some of his poems, and then others are just like his own poems. But they're all mixed together. You don't know like which is a translation, which is his own poem. And so I definitely think there are people that push that idea of like their own original versus a translation, and that's part of the project itself. Susan Bassnett also has a collection of Alejandra Pizarnik, where she has her own translations and her own poems. But those are more clearly demarcated, you know, poems versus that. But yeah, I've resisted the urge, I think.
I have another one. When I have found it almost impossible to translate my own stories that I've written, let's say in Spanish, right? So what I have done is that I have rewritten the story in English. And for example, in one where a religious situation was important, in the Spanish story they're Catholics, and in the English story they're Protestants. It's basically the same story, but I couldn't see any sensitivity in writing for an English reader. I think the Catholic images or allusions would not have the same emotion. So I thought, well, but I can do that because I was brought up Protestant. I'm a Mexican brought up Protestant, okay. and so I've hated both religions.
That's super interesting.
Right? But I know what they're about, and I know how Protestants feel, and I know how Catholics feel about certain things. But I just found it easier just to rewrite the story rather than even bother with translating the story.
That's super interesting. That's super interesting. And I mean, because you're the author, you
Right.
have this freedom. You can
Both
do
are
that.
mine.
And that's fascinating. Yeah. If I were translating something and I changed it from Catholicism to Protestantism, I'd need to have a really good reason to do that. You know, either because I'm doing a new project or I have the permission of the author, but because it's you doing your own work, it's a totally different. You have this creativity. Yeah.
Right, but isn't a translation your own work also?
Oh yeah, I believe that. Yeah.
I know that one of my students, because we're keeping journals, sort of, and so we've been asking questions, and one of them asked today, like, who is the judge, right, of whether your translation is faithful or good? And obviously, you talked about like when you have the author, you can talk to the author, but do you have like an imagined judge in your head?
The other problem is like, what is the original? Right? I mean, really, because sometimes there's multiple versions of something, or it was printed in different versions, you know, over time, or the wonderful translator from the Greek, Karen Emmerich, has this terrific story in the introduction to her book on literary translation and the making of originals, which came out a few years ago, where she tells that she was translating a contemporary Greek novelist, and the publisher in English said, okay, this book is like 600 pages long, but we want it to be 400, so you need to cut 200 pages out. And she's like, okay. And she went and she met with, luckily she could talk to him, so she met with the novelist, and he had a first edition of his book, and he pulled pages out of the book. Like, so he was like editing it by removing the pages. And then, you know, I'm gonna not remember all the ins and outs of it, but basically her conclusion was that the translation that she made didn't match any published original of his, right? So, and she explains that there's many, many more instances of this that happen than people realize when you come to a book and you think that the book is this finished object and you just need to move it from here to here, from one language to the other. But sometimes you can't locate that book or determine which version you're, I think there's a hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, because if I remember correctly, one of the key points of that anecdote was she was contractually obligated to produce a faithful translation.
Right.
Like the press that hired her to cut 200 pages also wrote in their contract that she had to sign, this will be a faithful translation, no creativity on your part.
Yes.
But so I guess that, which like, okay, the trouble that you guys, that was the point. But this sort of raises this issue to me. I'm Lucas Klein. I teach Chinese literature here. I've translated a good deal. I've translated a good deal of Chinese poetry into English, mostly contemporary, also some pre-modern stuff, a little bit of prose. And I pay a lot of attention to a lot of the ways that people and poets and translators talk about, this kind of thing. And I've gotten a little frustrated recently about how pervasive the rhetoric of creativity is in this. But yes, it's a very creative act. I'm really relieved to hear you guys not all saying, "Oh yeah, it's really creative," because and it's just the same as poetry. Like, we're still talking about representing something else and not having it be the same thing as our version. Right? There is a difference between our own creative work and the translations that we do, however much that's a blurry line. And so I guess I just wanted to sort of bring that out into like sharp relief here. I'm not quite phrasing this into a question really, but I just sort of wanted to.
It's a provocation.
Yeah.
We like provocations, yeah.
Well, because I actually might disagree. I didn't say this, but like I tend to think of translation as a form of creative writing with the most constraints. But I still think that it is a form of creative writing.
Yeah.
It just has the constraint is that you need to try to replicate as much as possible the one text in the next language. Which I can see why it annoys you.
No,
but
anything that I end up seeing repeated enough in a certain amount of time gets annoying.
Right, and I think the language we use about translation is difficult because this idea of being faithful is also problematic. I mean, like, we're married to the text, and so I think that we struggle to talk about what translation is and like what the rules are of it, and it does seem like that push towards thinking about creativity or like it being a creative act it seems a newer way of thinking about it. But it's incomplete as well. Because I would agree, when I translate, it's a much different process than when I write. It feels like you can fail in a way that you can't really when you write.
It does feel like, that there was like a moment, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago where like there was a lot of like translation in quotes, kind of like that people were using translation as this sort of starting point to create their own work, as you were suggesting, right? And it seems to me that like that has shifted a little bit. Like, people are very appropriation conscious right now in a way that they maybe weren't 15 years ago. But yeah, I mean, I think that there was that. There did feel like there was a moment where where there was a much kind of freer idea of what translation was. So, I don't know if that's your
Absolutely. Yeah, I really agree with what you said, Sarah, that it's more constrained as a process, right? By constraint, I mean you have requirements that you have to fulfill, right? Like that you have parameters to work within. Translation feels like it's a constraint to the second power. Like it's,
I wonder, following up on the notion of constraint and the notion of the freedom of, and put into the mix the notion of the freedom of the translator. What do you all think of retro versions? Do you play with retro versions? I'm thinking of the example that comes to mind is Marjorie Perloff translating Paul Celan's translations of Emily Dickinson. So Paul Celan, if you don't know who he is, was one of the most difficult, most experimental German poets of the 20th century. And he translated about 12 or 14 poems of Emily Dickinson, and Marjorie Perloff, a language philosopher, literary critic, comes along and translates Paul Celan's versions back into English. So you have the English, German, English, mediated by one of the most difficult, most experimental poets. And so you're free from the constraints of having to think about the original, but you're not, because how could you ignore Emily Dickinson? And yet there you, and so, I don't know, have you ever experimented
That's
with
super
that?
interesting, because on the one hand, like, that's a great exercise to give students, or
Yes.
to use to produce something, you know, for any creative person. So I think that's a really interesting process. On the other hand, you know, there's an important percentage of translations that are published every year throughout the world that are mediated through English. So a language with a small population of native speakers gets mediated through English into French or German or Italian, right? French is another language, sometimes from Arabic through to French into English or other languages. So, you know, that's like part of standard operating procedure for some presses, and we might think about the ethics of that and what that means, and about the positionality of English as a global language, and that's kind of an open discussion about it. But that's sometimes the only way that things make it into other languages.
I wonder too, I mean, I didn't know about that project, but like Dickinson is sort of the perfect writer for that, right? Because even putting Dickinson into any form of typography is like a translation, right?
Yeah.
So we don't actually know what the text was supposed to be in itself, right? So then it becomes, you know, like this, I don't know, even more distanced idea. So I mean, I like that Dickinson is the kind of starting point for that.
Yeah, there was a, McSweeney's put out an edition that was that exactly, and so, I don't remember when it was several years ago, but it's pretty interesting. And they have a number of different works that have been translated into one language, and then translated into another, and then translated into another, and they put them all together. It feels like a literary form of telephone, you know? But yeah, it's, I think it's, as far as a project goes, I think it's really cool.
What languages are students translating from?
My current dissertation project is translating William Blake's Sound of Innocence and Experience into from English into modern Chinese, and oftentimes I have this problem of how to keep the original rhyme schemes and like the internal rhymes, ending rhymes, and also the alliteration, consonants, assonants, all the sound features. Is there some effective ways to transfer the sound patterns and sound features into another language?
I mean, this is what I was maybe kind of thinking about. I mean, it's like really hard. I think that's the first thing to say. But that you look for other, like, if you can't, for example, like get all of the G's, right? Sounds, right? You maybe look for other letters that you can do that to, or other sounds, right? I think that that's maybe like a way that I've approached that problem, is to think like, where else can I, like, what can I do in English that I can't quite do with the text as it is?
That's an amazing project.
Yeah.
Lots of luck with it. Yeah.
My students have any questions? Okay.
I have a question about your translating process, because we read Daniel Han's book Catching Fire last week. He can adopt to not reading the book before you start translating it, because he wants to resemble the experience of any other reader discovering a book. And I want you experienced translators and how you translate that book.
So what's your process, yeah?
I tend to do something similar like that, where I will often maybe not have read a book, and I'll have read a portion of it, decided I really like the book, and then start translating it, right? Something like that. But the problem is that like after like draft number 5, I've read it lots of times, and then it becomes then that like process of discovery becomes like a process of rediscovery, I guess. But I like doing that, where I feel like I'm kind of discovering the book as I am translating it. But like, I would also just insist that is like step number 1, that like 5 years later, it sort of doesn't make a difference. But I don't know, I mean, he might, I think he translates very frequently and translates a lot. So for somebody who has translated many books, maybe that's a richer process.
Let's take one. Okay.
Sure.
I try to translate from Bengali to English and vice versa. So I was just thinking, right now I can sit here and think of at least 2 words in Bengali which are impossible to translate in English. So I was just thinking, like, how do you deal with such untranslatable words, and like, how do you, and specifically the words I'm talking about are very culture specific, something that doesn't exist in English. So like if I have to use those words in my translation, I have to give the whole cultural background. So how do you deal with such words, and what do you do when you encounter such words?
This is such a great question. I think many people wrestle with this in different languages. And this sort of gets to the question of cultural association that Daniel was mentioning earlier, like how much do you explain to the reader? And in some ways I feel like you sort of talked about different methods for doing that, right? Like you might put a footnote, or write a translator's introduction, or weave something into, if it's prose, make a little aside between commas where you explain what the thing is, right? So there's all kinds of like technical ways to do that. I think it's complicated because language is culture, right? And language has associations, and what the name of a certain kind of food may have a whole story, right? About all the customs and rituals and emotional associations you have with that food. So often, one solution people will come up with is to leave it in the original. Leave the original word, because that word is kind of more than itself, right? That word carries so much freight with it that you want to leave it as is and not come up with some invented English equivalent or corresponding word to it, and then find some way to explain it. I don't know.
I mean, some translators might actually invent a word, right?
Yeah,
which again is, I think the text you're translating will sort of determine if you feel like you have the freedom to do that. Like if it is a text that has that sense of experiment and I don't know, strangeness to it, right? But I would also say that there's also like really simple words, in Spanish at least, which are really hard to translate. Like the word agradable, which simply means like pleasant, right? But like it doesn't sound right at all. And it's like a really frequent word in Spanish, right? And so there are words like that don't necessarily carry a kind of baggage, but are really hard to find a good word for in English. And I think the other thing is like sometimes you feel like you have to be consistent, and you don't necessarily. Like if you're doing like a book and the same word appears several times, like there, it might be a good practice to use the same translation, but it might not, right? Like it might not be the right solution. So
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I think Sienna had one, and then maybe Austin.
So I did a few translations into French, from French to English, or the other way around, English to French. And I found that like the musicality of it is very difficult to like convey, especially in poetry rather than fiction. So do you feel like there's almost like a betrayal of the text if you can't get it into like the right words for it, or?
Do you want to start by reading the work out loud, ever? I mean, I guess if you don't read the book, then you don't read the book.
But no, yes.
Definitely read out loud. Oh, yeah. Over and over and over and over and over. Yeah.
No. I mean, to the extent that I try not to think about that word betrayal, I guess, right? Like, because again, I think that like is, like, you, at some point you have to make a choice, right? Like, and maybe like your choices there just aren't like great ones, and you just like have to figure out a choice to make, right? But like, even a bad translation, it's like is like maybe better than like silence. I don't know. I think like we can get so kind of concerned about the impossibility of translating something, and that it's really important to just to like think like, what if I don't do this? Like, what's going to happen if I don't do this? Like, on the one hand, you know, maybe nothing, right? But like that it's like, as a translator, it's really important, the work you're doing, right? And that like that should be a way of overcoming that silence or that fear of like getting the wrong, of making a mistake. Because I think that's what it's about, right? It's like not so much about betraying. It's like you're afraid that somebody or you will think you've made a mistake in some way. And like, again, like maybe you have, right? But like, it's not the worst thing in the world. And especially as you're starting to translate, right? Like, you're going to make lots of mistakes, and you will continue to do that as you translate longer and longer, and some of them might be really embarrassing later in your life, and you'll just like have to deal with that.
I think my question is some simulation of what Rohini asked earlier. So I translate from Urdu to English and also vice versa. And I've also encountered a similar problem where a concept or a noun or just an entity is untranslatable in any shape or form in English. And when I come to a crisis such as that, I go back to the question of what my intention with translation is. Is it that I want to make my language, the one I'm translating into or from, more accessible to an audience who does not speak that language? And by that, do I want to make concepts or the cultural legacy that comes with that language more accessible to that audience? Or do I want to remain faithful to the core of the text that I'm translating? So, and in that, because I'm further complicating that problem for myself, I just end up not reaching any answer as to whether or not I should leave it untranslatable. Because if I choose not to leave footnotes or extra comments with a term that's untranslatable and hence not translated into English or has no equivalent in English, then I'm running the risk of assuming whether or not the reader would make the effort of going on Google and searching what that term means. So I just wanted to hear what your thoughts were on that.
You know, it sounds like you're wrestling with some similar issues, actually. But you'll find your own creative way to address that, I think. Whether it's with a glossary or footnote or in-text kind of explanation. I don't think anything is actually untranslatable. You know, it's just, we just have to find a way to translate it. But yeah, we just have to stop not translating it when it's untranslatable. There's always a way.
Yeah, like another thing might be to just sort of get rid of the idea that there's a right translation, right? And like, you know, if you publish that translation, you can publish 3 versions of it, in which you explore all of those different choices. Because what you're talking about is like, what are the like choices that I am going to have to make, right? And those are, and there's like, that's a big version of it, but there's like little versions of that all the time, right? And so, so again, like at some point it feels like you have to make a choice, right? But like you can also make all the choices and just do them in different versions too. But that's what I would say is like, maybe don't be so hung up on the question of like the right version, but to think about like this version of it is going to allow me to highlight, you know, some of these questions and problems that you're thinking about.
maybe on the note that everything is translatable, have a good place to stop. We'll give Sarah back her class, but I want to thank you so much for coming. The English department is also hosting a reading with Rachel Galvin and Daniel Borzutzky tomorrow, 3 to 4:15 p.m. at the same place. So come back and maybe ask the question you didn't get to ask today. And yeah, we invite you there as well. Thank you. Round of applause for our panel.